Coming up on Why Should I Trust You? There are few individuals who are more polarizing today than Dr. Anthony Fauci. Depending on who you voted for, which timeline you look at in your news feed, or who you typically hang out with, to you, Fauci is either a hero or a villain. Just yesterday, at 85, retired and preemptively pardoned by President Biden, America's top infectious disease expert was subpoenaed to testify before Congress by his chief nemesis, Republican Senator Rand Paul. And in the hearing, after the senator released sections of the doctor's personal diary from the pandemic, Dr. Fauci pleaded the fifth, invoking his right not to answer questions in response to all questions in the hearing, which he said at the outset was the product of Senator Paul's, quote, unhinged obsession with him. Today, we're going to dig into why all these years after the pandemic, we're still talking about Anthony Fauci. We're going to be joined by Katelyn Jetelina of Your Local Epidemiologist and David Wallace-Wells of the New York Times. What was the goal of bringing Dr. Fauci back to testify? Is there a good argument to be made that hearing from him now under oath gets us closer to understanding what caused the pandemic? Or was this all really just about vengeance, political point scoring? Was it rightfully about accountability? What do more than 1,000 pages of diary entries just released reveal about the man who became the face of the pandemic response? What does it say about America that 6 years out from the start of the pandemic, we're still wrestling with the origins of COVID? That if we know where it came from, it will reveal who we can blame. A lot to get to, so let's get started. Hey, welcome, everyone. We're so glad you've joined us. We are recording this on Wednesday afternoon, just a few hours after Dr. Anthony Fauci was in front of Congress. There's a lot to get into about what happened and what it says about the divisions in America that still feel pretty raw. We're really excited that Katelyn Jetelina and David Wallace-Wells are going to join us in a minute. But first, who are we? I'm Brenda Adhikari.
I'm Tom Johnson.
I'm Maggie Bartlett.
And I'm Dr. Mark Abdimalik.
And this is Why Should I Trust You, which is all about trying to understand the breakdown in trust in public health, medicine, science, and AI, and what might be done to build it back. And just a big reminder, you can always contact us by emailing questions at whyshoulditrustyou.net.
Okay, so look, today was a kind of a wild day. There was obviously the hearing. There's also been these diaries that have been released, and my head has just been kind of scrambled on this issue. So that's why we're inviting Katelyn and David to help us kind of unpack it. But Tom, before we bring them in, just help us set the stage of what went down today.
Yeah, we could just do the basics. So we're talking about Dr. Anthony Fauci. So he was subpoenaed to testify before the Senate Homeland Security Committee. And Republican Senator Rand Paul is the committee's chair. And Paul is a fierce critic of Dr. Fauci. So a little context here. Just this past weekend, Senator Paul released over 1,000 pages from Dr. Fauci's diary, which the doctor wrote during the height of the pandemic, when he was the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And as we said, he really became the face of the government's public health and scientific response to COVID. So HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said that he gave the senator the diaries so they could, quote, see the light of day. And the diaries appear to have been kept by Dr. Fauci on a work computer. So anyway, stepping back, Senator Paul argues the evidence points towards a lab origin in Wuhan, China, including what he terms dangerous gain of function research that he alleges Dr. Fauci's agency funded. So he accuses Dr. Fauci of covering up the nature of the NIH-funded research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And he says he did that to avoid culpability for the pandemic, and it included Fauci suppressing the lab leak theory and lying to Congress about it. So Dr. Fauci denies that the NIH-funded gain-of-function research at the Wuhan lab, and he says he is open to the possibility, or has been open to the possibility, that COVID-19 leaked from a lab, but he believes the virus more likely spread naturally from animals to humans. So Senator Paul also said today that Dr. Fauci had used his influence to usher in the COVID lockdowns by convincing state and local officials to enforce them, and then using his authority to justify it all to the public. And this is something that came up in those diary excerpts as well. And then it was Dr. Fauci's turn to give opening remarks. And he spoke about, his respect for congressional oversight and how he had testified or briefed House and Senate committees over 200 times, including hearings and in interviews on these very pandemic issues. But Dr. Fauci said that the senator had a unhinged, those were his words, obsession with him. And given the senator's obsession with calling for his prosecution, as well as slanderous comments about him, and the senator releasing those diary excerpts, which Fauci said was an attempt to intimidate and embarrass him, Fauci said the only conclusion that he could reach was that Senator Paul's calling him to testify today was to get him to say something that could vindicate the senator's, quote, repeated public pledges that he end up behind bars.
So, Tom and everyone, you'll recall that President Biden, at the end of his term, issued a preemptive pardon to Dr. Fauci, perhaps for this very reason. So that pardon does not cover crimes committed after the pardon was issued, and lying to Congress is a crime. So from Dr. Fauci's opening statement forward, every question that was asked of him, he answered with, on advice of counsel, I am invoking my Fifth Amendment right. So zooming out, at the heart of Senator Paul's hearing today and past hearings that we've already had in Congress on this origins of COVID story, you'll hear, was it a lab leak or is it a natural origin? In other words, this pandemic that, killed, 1.2 million Americans, and did it essentially spread to humans from an animal, or did it originate and spread after an intentional or maybe an unintentional leak from a lab in China? Now, this is a question that we're still grappling with, and our guests today are going to help us understand what we know and what we don't know. Now, and scientists have said in papers that we talk about, trying to figure this out, understanding the circumstances that lead to pandemics is important for their prevention. So it's not just like scoring points. It's, again, to help society so that we don't find ourselves in this situation. But the problem is this remains one of the most consequential, unanswered questions in modern science. So about those diary excerpts, those entries cover everything from the early scientific uncertainty surrounding the origins of the virus to his sudden celebrity status that he found himself with, and also his dealings with the media. He talks about specific conversations with reporters, and he even talks about difficult interactions he had with President Trump. And he also talks about why he found himself in those situations, being at the forefront of all of this. So Senator Paul argues that the diaries reveal a disconnect between what Fauci considered privately and what he said publicly, particularly about the origins of COVID-19. Others say the entries simply capture scientific uncertainty evolving in real time. And we're going to ask our guests whether this release revealed anything genuinely important or whether the significance of these diaries has been overstated. Now, after this hearing, finally, Senator Rand Paul said his committee will vote on a contempt resolution against Fauci next week. So Senator Paul is escalating the confrontation and will try to have the Senate or perhaps the courts declare that Fauci had no valid basis for remaining silent and not answering questions during the hearing today.
Thanks, guys. And look, before we bring our guests in, I just want to make it clear that we know that, the name Anthony Fauci brings up a lot of emotions for our listeners. We know that there's several people, particularly supporters of Secretary Kennedy, who hear that name and it immediately kind of conjures up somebody who they think has not been held accountable for the pandemic. Our guests today, we believe, are very nuanced about Dr. Fauci, and we're not really here to kind of like score points on one side or the other. We're really just trying to understand kind of why we're still talking about this man, and we're trying to bring in some nuance to what actually happened today. So coming up next, we have Katelyn, Jetelina, and David Wallace-Wells. And a big Why Should I Trust You? Welcome to two close friends of the show, Katelyn, Jetelina, and David Wallace-Wells. Katelyn is the founder of the super popular Your Local Epidemiologist newsletter and platform. As an epidemiologist, Katelyn worked around the clock during the pandemic. She's advised organizations, including the CDC, and is a leading public health communicator. Hi, Katelyn.
Thanks for having me.
David Wallace-Wells is a columnist for the New York Times, where he writes about science, including a special focus on climate change and technology. He has covered the COVID-19 pandemic extensively and has conducted one of the most extensive series of interviews ever done with Dr. Fauci for the New York Times. Hi, David.
Hey, guys.
All right, so welcome to you both. Look, we're going to talk a bunch about Anthony Fauci today, the diaries, his legacy. But first, we basically emergency texted both of you to hop on today because we wanted you to help us understand what the hell happened today. Katelyn, let's start with you.
Oh, man. I mean, a lot went through my mind when I was watching it. But I mean, the high level, Anthony Fauci went to testify and pleaded the fifth. And they threw every single topic at him that you could imagine. And he stayed quiet. And I don't think it's a very big surprise that he pleaded the fifth. I think they were looking for any reason for him to go around his pardon from Biden. And it didn't really reveal anything, honestly. It was kind of a dud. And maybe that was his purpose and his point of doing it.
Yeah, David, is that basically is this went exactly how you thought today? And he pleaded the fifth and you were like, well, that's how it was going to go.
I was surprised that he pleaded the fifth. And I frankly thought it was pretty cowardly and a kind of a disservice to the country. And I do think that something was revealed that's sort of important and profound, which is the degree to which we are living in so many different realities in our memory and arguments about COVID. You have, on the one hand, Republican ideologues who are sort of boiling with grievance still from 5 or 6 years ago. Many of those grievances aren't really held by their constituents, but their leaders, I guess, still are very angry, as are many Americans, but not a majority. You have Democrats who want to be able to say that they're defending the science, but don't really know what to say beyond that and feel a little empty in their performance anytime they try to make any argument about public health and the pandemic. And then you have, in the middle, kind of embodiment of the public health establishment, scientific establishment, who is mute and who is unwilling or unable to directly answer his critics and to offer an affirmative argument on behalf of decisions that were made in 2020 or 2021, reflect on what he may have learned, just not interested in that. And what worries me most about this spectacle is the possibility that we're going to be living in those different realities going forward. And that without an event like this to really hash things out, without Rand Paul and Anthony Fauci yelling at each other, we may not really get beyond the lines we've all drawn in the sand. And that is not good on many fronts.
Boy, that has really fired my synapses, David. This is going to be a spicy conversation. But Katelyn, you just shared something with me. I'm honored that you shared it with me. But you said leave the man alone. That was the title of your essay. Talk a little bit about that. You think it's time to leave Anthony Fauci alone?
Yeah. So in my essay, what brought up a lot watching Anthony Fauci was my own experiences that I've been through the past 6 years on being on the front lines, being assaulted, being doxxed and hacked and death threats and all of this sort of stuff, mainly driven by, I think it was fear as well as immense anger. And, when I reflect back at that, a lot of the decisions I made when I was in Texas, but also trying to write through was really reflective of we made mistakes. There's no doubt about that. There was a lot of mistakes made. I'm very angry sometimes at Anthony Fauci for the mistakes he made because they were preventable. And in fact, I think swayed me wrong sometimes too. But also we are forced into these systems that work around us. And I think that a lot of the anger has really snowballed into beyond a pandemic that we are in right now, from everything around all of our systems and really targeting one person. And, I wrote in the piece that, there's quite a lot of survivor's guilt that I have in this moment too, watching him. And if we really want to fix the systems, it wasn't going to be this. I think I disagree with David in that aspect. I don't think a conversation between Rand Paul and Anthony Fauci screaming at each other is really going to change anyone's minds. We have been put into these camps already. And I think the biggest question is what is, and I don't know if anyone knows that. I think it's time to actually start fixing the systems because they sucked back then and they still suck now.
David, you said you found what Fauci did today is cowardly. Just talk through that a little bit. I mean, I imagine there's many listeners who are hearing this and thinking this wasn't above board. This was an entrapment. This wasn't a good faith effort to figure out, the origins of the pandemic. This was about vengeance, political point scoring, and good for Dr. Fauci, who has testified on these issues already, done interviews on the record on these issues already, that he just said, no, I'm not playing. I'm not putting myself and my family at risk so you can score points.
Well, let me start by saying what I thought about all these issues yesterday, which is to say I very much agreed with the perspective that Katelyn just laid out. I think that Anthony Fauci has become the scapegoat for this pandemic for a huge portion of the country. I think that the arguments that are made against him by his critics are often contradictory. They suggest wildly different approaches to the pandemic. It's, you have Rand Paul saying, how come Fauci's, obsessing over his phone calls with Barbara Streisand with tens of thousands of Americans dying, but he's also thinks that Fauci pushed a much more restrictive COVID mitigation program than he would have liked. So it's like, what is it? Are you not paying enough attention to the deaths of Americans? Are you paying too much attention to the deaths of Americans? There's similar contradictions layered through so much of the public's rage, to the extent that it is rage against Fauci. And I think it's really unfortunate. It signals that few of us are seeing the experience of that period very clearly. And we are just, so many of us, so eager to pin the blame on someone as a way of avoiding thinking about more systemic problems. Yes, that's part of it, but also just the sheer difficulty of navigating a pandemic in a complicated, divided country, which is just a project inherently laced with trade-offs. And we want to believe that it was possible to avoid all those trade-offs and simply avoid the pandemic, as though Anthony Fauci was singularly responsible for a disease that killed 30 million people all around the world. And even if you believe, that this disease came out of a lab in Wuhan, I think it's an open question, but even if you believe that, that story is still bigger than Anthony Fauci. The story of our response to that disease is still bigger than Anthony Fauci. And I think that there's something incredibly reductive about the desire to string him up as a villain. It avoids our reckoning with how scared we all were in 2020. The people who now oppose mitigation restrictions, many of them were supportive of it back then. It pushes, it's just a sort of a convenient scapegoat for a country that wants to move on and still nurse grievances about the pandemic, but basically not think all that much about it. The reason that I thought that it was unfortunate that he chose to speak openly is because I would like to see many of these things hashed out in public. And I take the point that this is not the best format. I also, and I would like to see more open faith conversations, back and forth a lot, of the kind that you guys do here, in more venues with bigger audiences at higher levels of visibility. And yet I still think it's good to take those opportunities when they come, even if the context is quite, complicated and fraught. And I thought, watching Fauci this morning, a lot about an exchange that he and I had a few years ago when I was interviewing him in the aftermath of the pandemic emergency, in which we talked about a previous back and forth he had had with Rand Paul about COVID origins and gain of function, and in which he very categorically dismissed Paul's assertion that the US government had funded gain of function research. And I said to him that I didn't think that that was a very sophisticated, nuanced, responsive answer that he had given. I actually think that he was basically lying, although you could sort of quibble with that. But in any event, I don't think that he was being forthright in his response to Paul. And he said to me in a kind of, standoffish, like Bigfooting way, David, have you ever testified before Congress? And I said, yes, I had. And he said, well, then you know how hard it is to express nuance in that context. And I said, well, maybe so, but if I'd been in your shoes, I would have said, gain of function means different things to different people. It includes things that everyone agrees are useful, like doing research on flu vaccines. It also can refer to research that some people think is risky and other people think is worthwhile. I personally, Anthony Fauci, think that even that work is worthwhile, but it's a conversation worth having. And yet I can say that according to the NIH definition, this research did not qualify as gain of function research, as you're suggesting. And Fauci said to me, okay, if I had the opportunity, I would answer that question in exactly the same way, with exactly that kind of nuance. And today he had the opportunity to answer those kinds of questions in that kind of way, and he declined to. And that's not a disservice because I think Anthony Fauci should be thrown in jail. I think Anthony Fauci made mistakes throughout the pandemic, but is basically a hero. I think that he did great. He did incredibly important work during
So
this
David,
period.
are you saying that, and I want to ask Katelyn this in a second, but David, if I'm hearing you, it's like you almost are saying he had a moral obligation to speak up, and they're just the importance is too grand for him to just kind of be like, plead the fifth. But Katelyn, when you say leave the man alone, which is kind of like the other side of that, is there a risk that the public just says, okay, that means we just don't have to ask any more questions? Like, just, we don't know, just like move on. Like, where is the line?
Absolutely not. And I think I need to edit my headline now because, but like, there's nuances here, right? Like there's
so many nuances. Yeah,
there is. And I'm just a nuanced person. That's just like, I think that's why I love David Wallace-Wells so much too. Like, it's just how I think. And I absolutely think there needs to be conversations. I continue to be just completely shocked we didn't have a 9/11 type commission after losing 1.5 million Americans to like, how is that even possible? Like, I don't even understand how we haven't had that. And so like David says, like, I think we should have conversations. I don't think it should just be Tony Fauci. Like, there's a lot of people that made a lot of mistakes, but also did a lot of good. I will also say I'm actually not too surprised to hear about your conversation, David, with Fauci, because one of my biggest pieces of feedback to him is how terrible he did at communication and communicating uncertainty and nuance. And it was incredibly confusing. It caused a lot of whiplash. And there was very little transparency to know what was going on. And in the end, it really backfired. It's not how you build trust. So
is anything in the did anything in the diaries, inform that what you just said? Like, did you read something that recent over the weekend?
Oh, yeah.
Like, what was in the diaries that makes you say that he was not so good at communicating uncertainty when the everything was uncertain at the time?
Right. But he was talking about uncertainty in his diaries, right? Like, he was talking about how he had a conversation of, is this a lab leak or is this intentional? Like, we don't really know. We're having a conversation. Like, and then it came out very clearly, at least to me, I distinctly remember that it was only a spillover, end of conversation. That's it. And that's just not the reality of the conversations that were happening behind the scenes. And I felt like that transparency, I would have appreciated it as someone who's trying to communicate to the public as well.
But just for a second, I mean, I know it's easy. I feel like it's easy to say that now, but like, we so much ask our leaders to just be clear, give us a clear message, help us understand.
Wrong. I think you never underestimate the intelligence of the public and the audience. They want nuance and they deserve nuance. And saying that we only need 3 words strung together in a sentence, I mean, you'd see this with everything in public health, right? Like, get your flu shot, like all of it. Like, it undermines. And I think one thing that I learned over the past 7 years was that people want to know and they deserve to know, and they can handle it. And you can do it in a way that is balanced. You can insert your expertise. I don't think expertise is dead. You can insert the probabilities and where you land. But again, it's an art. None of us scientists have ever been taught to this art, but I think that needs to change. And I hope people are seeing that.
David, when people talk like we got to throw Fauci in jail because of what he said about masks or about like the 6 feet rule. Like, I'm always like, listen to yourself. Like, that just sounds so ridiculous, right? Even to me, I'm like, about masks. Like, really? That's why. But the one thing that I struggle with is like, if I'm somebody who's not sure about where COVID came from and I believe in the lab leak theory, that means I'm believing that potentially the US government funded research that resulted in a potential accident or intentional event in China. And I find that unforgivable. Like, that changed my life. That completely ruined everything, resulted in millions of people dying. That feels very separate than did we keep schools open too long, 3 feet, 6 feet, masks. Talk to us about like whether you put COVID origins necessarily in a different bucket than some of this other stuff.
I do. I think that if this disease killed 1.5 million Americans and 30 million people around the world, that's a much bigger weight of responsibility than any of the questions of mitigation that we took. I do think that mitigation helped save millions of lives, tens of millions probably around the world, probably a couple million in the US, but that's quite small compared to a death toll of the size that we're talking about from this disease. So I think that is really consequential. But I think a couple things. One is that we don't know that this thing came out of a lab, very far from it. The science is very ambiguous and open-ended. I mean, we've talked about this on the show before. I am maybe a little bit more open to the possibility that this came out of a lab than some of the rest of you, but I certainly don't think that we can treat it as a foregone conclusion, and or the basis of a legal or cultural prosecution. I think it's far too unknown. In that context, I think many figures involved in that debate early on did not behave appropriately, including Tony Fauci. I do think that he downplayed the possibility beyond even his own understanding at the time. I don't think that there were great revelations in these diaries about that exactly. And I don't think there were really many revelations of that kind throughout these diaries about any of these questions. I'm particularly interested in the way that he downplayed the risk of breakthrough infections and deaths. And there are things in there I could point to and say, okay, like he had these ideas that he wasn't expressing in public. But in the grand scheme of things, they're quite small. And the main revelation of the diaries is that he was preoccupied with media coverage and the way that he was being portrayed and becoming an incredibly famous person. It doesn't dominate in terms of word count. The word count is still mostly accounts of his conversations and arguments with other public health leaders, but it is the most striking thing about these diaries. And that just reminds us that on this central question, we are not in a place where we can really make a strong argument because we're still living in so much ambiguity and uncertainty. And over the last few weeks, I think the more striking problem, the more striking disclosure was what we saw from Christian Anderson a few weeks ago in his Slacks, speaking months after the publication of Proximal Origins, saying he thought it was more likely that it was a lab leak than a natural origin, and entertaining that possibility, maybe not saying it was more likely, but still entertaining it well into 2021. Now, this is one of the fiercest attack dogs of the natural origin hypothesis. And he is seen here really, really betraying his public positioning.
Is this separate from the diaries? This is a separate document?
Yeah.
Right.
Nothing like that to me. I see nothing like that from Tony Fauci. I see, he's more nuanced in his private communications and thinking than he is in public, but he's not outright contradicting what he's saying in public.
But David, do you think that Fauci was not entertaining publicly the ambiguity over whether this leaked from a lab or came from animals because he was protecting science from being blamed in the heat of the pandemic for something that hadn't been established yet? Or do you think he was just honestly sensing a consensus or the slight majority of a consensus of scientists that this likely wasn't lab, so he was trying to be clear and just communicate something that he felt was going to was going to be the reason why this all happened in the first place. And how much do
It-
you know what I'm saying? Like, what
If
do you
I
come
had
down
to, I mean, it's always hard to assess someone else's motivations.
Yeah.
I think that that his position was sort of multiply determined. There was a lot of motivation that was pushing him to take the position that he took. I think just as a starting point, I would note in 2020, the people who who believed in a lab origin and who were raising that possibility were doing so essentially to blame China. Relatively soon after Biden took office, the whole political meaning of that hypothesis changed, and now it was being used to blame Anthony Fauci. And in both cases, it's an exercise of, diversion, of responsibility placing. But it was almost as though where we were placing that responsibility was less important than that we were
what do you get
dumping
out
it
of
on
it?
someone else.
What does that one side get out of it for blaming Fauci? Is it anti-establishment? Is it
Well, I think it allows them to see the entire experience of the pandemic as something that liberal America foisted on them and imposed on them. That is to say, the disease itself and the mitigation measures that were erected in response, both of those were kind of conspiracy coming out of dark rooms at the NIH, and which anyone with any sense would have objected to. But when he was saying we shouldn't talk about that, I think probably some of it was like we shouldn't distract our efforts at reducing the spread of the virus by talking about origins. He probably had some understanding that it would be geopolitically complicated, which I'm sure it would have been if the U.S. was really trying to push that harder. He, I think, was personally loyal to a number of scientists who were involved. And I think he also was invested in and to some extent really believed as a true believer that this kind of research was incredibly valuable and should be defended. That said, he did have these phone calls. There was not an obvious, a universal consensus on those phone calls. And he characterized them later in misleading ways. And I think that, that is something I think we should fault him for. It doesn't mean that the public wasn't able to think through this possibility. By the summer of 2020, something like 40% of the country believed that the disease came out of a lab. It wasn't like it was, that information was completely there was a chokehold on it and nobody could get to it. But he, I think, did us a disservice. I think that he did it for some mix of high-minded and interpersonal reasons. And I think, if we could all go back in time and I could have a conversation with him then personally, I would urge him to be a little bit more open about it. But I also, just to be totally clear, I don't think we should overstate how completely unequivocal he was on this point. In most interviews, going back to 2020, he would say, yeah, it's possible, but I really feel strongly that the scientific consensus is that the likelier outcome was that it came from nature. I've seen very few examples of him absolutely discarding it as a possibility. And then I think Katelyn was talking about this a little bit earlier. I think it gets to some bigger questions about pandemic management, which is we can talk about the need for nuance from our leaders, but there's also like, what nuance are we willing to hear? What nuance are we able to hear? And to what extent do we process even caveated statements and guidance from our leaders in far more, black and white terms than the text on the page really implies? I think one of the lessons of the pandemic is that even when people do try to be nuanced, the public processes it in a completely unnuanced way.
Well, and then even looking back, right, David, you and I've had lots of conversations about pandemic revisionism and like how much our viewpoints change over time, depending on what our experience was, what our exposures were, who we are, what we believe in, what our values are. And I think we have to be very careful also looking back because we all have those biases, no matter who we are.
Yeah, I mean, even my feelings about Fauci, I was just remembering this morning a phone call I had with a friend and prominent epidemiologist in 2023 when Fauci announced his retirement. And at the time, he was very pro-Fauci, and I was like listing all these things that Fauci had gotten wrong. And now I feel like I've come out the other side, and I'm like, God, Fauci is just being like scapegoated, and on net, like we should be applauding this man. And Fauci didn't do much between 2023 and 2026, but my position on him has changed a lot, in part because the tenor of the public conversation has changed so much.
Yeah. I mean, I think if there wasn't this like threat of criminal prosecution, I think, again, maybe the conversation would have gone a lot differently. But Katelyn, you talked about, something like a 9/11 commission. I think we can all agree we still need like a national reckoning on this stuff. What does meaningful accountability look like at this point? Like, what would it look like? Who would be involved? Have you thought about it? Have you had conversations about it?
I've thought about it. I don't know exactly who. I think that one of the challenges is that the United States is just so big. We basically had 50 different responses all at once, right? Yes, you have the federal. My experience as an epidemiologist in helping the pandemic response in Texas was way different than in California. And I mean, we opened schools in August of 2020. And so there, I think that's one of the challenges here is that you have 50 different responses you have to look at. Two is I think that in order to have a 9/11 commission, you kind of have to have bipartisan support and people to come together and be like, this is important, and just look at how polarized our landscape is. And I agree, we need it. I don't think it's really going to happen. For accountability, for Fauci, I would love, and I don't think we're not going to get that now because there's just such a bad faith effort. I don't think he can engage, honestly, even if he wanted to. But I wish that he admitted to his mistakes, even to us scientists. I don't think enough people have. What went wrong, what went right, and how are we going to do better next time is how I would frame it. Because there's a lot we got wrong. Some of it because we just didn't know, right? You're going 2,000 miles per hour. Some of it was definitely avoidable. I've written about all the mistakes I've made. I wish more people did it out there too. I think that's what people want to hear. I don't think that would solve everything, but in a world we have so little accountability wherever you look, it is really important, and I think would do a lot of healing.
I want to move us a little bit to Fauci's diaries, what he said about, like the fame that he was getting and the Barbara Streisand call. And, I think someone noticed that the phrase prolonged standing ovation appeared 7 times throughout the diary. He wrote things like, it's truly unbelievable. People are naming their dogs after me. Sally Quinn saying that I was the erotic lead male in a book she wrote in 1994. The reason I bring this up is, like, obviously there's the holy shit, he's like so thirsty and whatnot that's coming out. But to me, it actually exposes something else, David, which is that, like, was he really a leader at that time? Was that leadership? Was he exhibiting leadership? I don't think Donald Trump was exhibiting leadership, but I think the thing I wrestle with was whether Anthony Fauci was really exhibiting much leadership either. Like, I think partly what's happening in this moment is we're wrestling with the fact that, man, that was like our biggest crisis in modern US history, at least since 9/11. And say what you will about George W. Bush, a lot of people feel like he really stepped up in the immediate aftermath of the towers falling. You had FDR during World War II. When you see all that stuff about the fame, is it just kind of like eye-rolly to you, or do you think it's actually indicative of something bigger?
It's closer to just eye roll inducing to me. I think it's embarrassing for him. It's unbecoming. I wish that the person in that position was a little less preoccupied with his public stature. I also think that anyone who was having the experience that he was having would have been reflecting on the weirdness of that experience if they were human. That doesn't mean that they were writing about it every night in their diary. It doesn't mean that they had to cut and paste all their clippings, but he had an extremely weird 2020. I mean, we all had weird 2020s. He had an extremely weird 2020. And, do I think that, like, he's a little bit of an egotist was enamored with the fact of his own fame? Yes. I also think that's true of Donald Trump and Barack Obama and Joe Biden, and like everybody who is in public life is going to have some version of that. Do I think that it meaningfully impeded his leadership role? I think we have to ask here, as Katelyn was sort of suggesting in the possibility of a 9/11 style commission, what is the question we're asking? What is the core issue that we're raising with the response? I was talking this morning with my brother about some of these issues, and he was talking about how, in some parts of the country, when they reopened schools, it was like you'd go into one mode where you'd be mostly open, then you'd have to pull back into a mostly closed mode. And one of the things that families got irritated about was the back and forth and the instability and the unknowability. And it really, to me, illustrated one basic problem here, which is like, at the moment, many people faulting Fauci et al. For the management of the pandemic would say they weren't responsive enough to the news on the ground. They imposed a single uniform piece of guidance across the country for many months. They didn't understand the way that that could be modulated up and down. We needed to be able to give people a break. We couldn't impose lockdown on them forever, putting aside the quote unquote lockdowns just lasted a few months. But that there was a sense looking back that the whole thing was too uniform, imposed too unilaterally across all of these different populations, not responsive to the changing nature of the threat. But in the places where they did try to be more responsive and did do things like impose mask guidance and then withdraw it, and then impose it again in time of surge, or open, close, and then close them, open schools and then close them again, people got irritated by that too. And that just, to me, is a sign among so many others here that when we take issue with particular policy choices, we are really expressing frustration with how difficult it is to wade through the human mess of a pandemic, to deal with the illness, to deal with the death, to deal with the inevitable disruption, to deal with our own feelings of fear, to deal with our own feelings of resentment, and to try to keep those in any kind of meaningful balance. It is so hard. Pandemics suck. And Tony Fauci is getting shit from all of us. I think primarily he made mistakes. I do not want to walk away from that. Getting shit from us primarily because pandemics suck and we don't want to have to face that fact. So if I think back to what we might have asked of more of him, it's something like more nuance, more acknowledgement of uncertainty, maybe a little bit more deference to local communities and making decisions on their own, particularly around things like schools. And yet I come back to again and again this interview that he gave on CNN in May of 2020, where he says to Chris Cuomo, I can't tell anybody how to live their lives. I can't tell anyone to stay home. That the public guidance cannot last forever because people are going to need to live their lives. And Cuomo says to him, so you're acknowledging that you're losing this argument, meaning about, how to restrict the disease. And Fauci acknowledges that he is in May of 2020. So we have these leaders who they made mistakes, but to the extent that they were designing public messaging for the public, I think they were trying to include nuance and include uncertainty. They were also trying to be clear and legible, and that's a different set of priorities. But we are so eager to fault them that I think we don't even acknowledge that what they were doing was so hard and that they were probably doing their best to fulfill their obligations in the context of all that difficulty.
I mean, I think putting it like he had a weird 2020 is like putting it lightly. I mean, if we look at the decisions, the hard questions, I mean, you also have to ask, why him? He wasn't the head of the CDC. He wasn't the head of the NIH. He wasn't the head of the FDA. He was just kind of plucked, for a variety of reasons to be.
Can I say one thing? Also, Donald Trump was the president. Joe Biden was not the president in 2020. Yeah. Donald Trump was the president. Tony Fauci, he brought Tony Fauci on stage. He also argued with him, but Donald Trump is the man in charge of this country. Tony Fauci was not the man in charge of this country. He was. Yeah.
A lot of people would see Tony Fauci as a dedicated public servant, trying to protect everybody in a difficult situation. It's hard to imagine now with this conversation, will history remember that part of him alongside the lack of nuance and the mistakes, about masks and, what we talked about. But Katelyn, do you worry that in our effort to hold Fauci accountable, we're losing sight of the scale of what he was faced with and the good he was doing? And how do we get people like Fauci to rise up? Who is going to be our spokesperson for the next pandemic if this is how we treat somebody who's given his all?
You're not going to get one. Well, you will, because we care too much. But it's hard. And it's a real question. I mean, one of the quotes I always think about with HIV is that we tried and we did not flee, right? I see Fauci as really standing up and not fleeing while 3,500 Americans died per day. if this is how it's taught, I don't really want to raise my hand for the next emergency because there are a lot of trade-offs. It's almost impossible to govern 340 million Americans who have all different experiences and morals and values and whatever, all of it. And, I think one reason why he was plucked was because of his service over the past 50 years. And it was bipartisan service. You have PEPFAR, right? He was one of the principal architects of PEPFAR, President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief under the Bush administration that saved more than 20 million lives. You had HIV/AIDS. He was one of the first researchers to publish on HIV, and he did not do that well, but he listened to advocates and, changed course with that. And so, I think that at the end of this, we're all humans too. And I, for one, am thankful that Trump picked Fauci to help in the beginning. I think he again had a lot he could have done differently. But as a young rising epidemiologist, we need people to stand up in times that are hard.
And that's, I think, one additional micro tragedy to this pleading the fifth thing, which is that it suggests that Fauci isn't seeing beyond the current moment, beyond the current political conflict, beyond, the Trump administration, Trump 2. This was, in theory, an opportunity for him to speak for his legacy and for posterity about the pandemic in the face of real-time criticism and offer a sort of at least his definitive account of why he, did X, Y, and Z. And I think it's unfortunate that we were deprived that opportunity.
Hearing you guys, it's like you're absolutely right, David, that if we had a commission, what is the problem that we are trying to sort of get that answer to? You've all articulated it was a crazy time. He is a human being. Donald Trump was the president. This guy, Anthony Fauci, dedicated his life to public service. It's funny. I've been thinking a lot about somebody else who I really admire in the field of medicine lately, and that's Paul Farmer. So for those who don't know, Paul Farmer is a medical anthropologist. He was a physician. He died, I think, in 2022. He lived a lot of his life in places like Haiti and Rwanda and parts of South America. And the thing that I always associate with Paul Farmer is how close he was to the communities that he served, right? That there was something about him that was like when you see pictures of Pope Francis, like washing the feet of prisoners and something, like that's who Paul Farmer was, right? In reading Anthony Fauci's diaries, I couldn't help but feel like the person we are saying is a hero is this person really dedicated to the institution of medicine, the sort of professionalism and the expertise of medicine, which I am here to say it is being destroyed and single-handedly dismantled, and that's important. But David, do you see what I mean? That Anthony Fauci is not Paul Farmer. And I wonder if in that moment, in our country being so, we're not monoculture anymore. We're so divided. And maybe it's not fair to even ask Anthony Fauci to be a Paul Farmer. Maybe we would have been better off with that kind of figure in a way. Is that being fair?
Well, I think part of what you're describing is the collective experience of the pandemic, which is just that we were isolated from one another. We were isolated from the sick. We were isolated from the dying. That was true in medical settings. It was true in political settings. It was true in our personal lives. And Fauci, I think, did visit, hospitals and talk to patients, but it wasn't the kind of communing with the victims of this disease like you're describing. On the other hand, my personal suspicion would be that someone who spent a lot more time in COVID wards in March and April of 2020 would have been even more eager to do more to stop the spread of this disease. And that most of Fauci's haters, whether they're the hysterical ones or the nuanced ones, fault him in retrospect for doing too much. And I don't know if we would have been better served by someone who is more present and on the ground back then, because I think ultimately the backlash is not about the perspective, the connection between public health leadership and the sick. It is about public health leadership and the well, who resented being asked to do so much.
That's a really excellent observation. Kate, wow, I'm just like gonna let that seep through my brain a little bit. But Caitlin, what do you think about that? Like, was Anthony Fauci always kind of set up to fail? And in a way, in our super atomized culture, although ironically, like I worked in network news at the time, and like network news ratings went up like for the first time in a really long time, because guess what? Everyone was turning on their TVs at 6:30 to actually watch the news again. There actually was a little bit more of a monoculture during COVID. But what are your thoughts on all this?
I mean, I think that there's a inherent value of being connected to people on the ground. And we see this a lot in public health when you have a very big public health leader, Ann Zink, for example, right? Chief medical officer or something in Alaska, but still sees patients for 6 days a month. So she's still connected on the ground to patients and experiences and what everyone's actually facing. I think far too often leaders up in ivory towers are incredibly disconnected from the main battlefield of sediment, from fears and frustrations, and from lived realities. I don't know if that was Fauci. I know he was still treating patients quite often. I know that from his AIDS work, one reason why a lot switched was because he started working with advocates in the AIDS movement, and that takes listening, right? So I don't know if that's necessarily him, but I will say that we need to do a lot better listening. One of the things I often say is I'm so, so, so thankful I was an epidemiologist during the pandemic in Texas, because it made my liberal California views, it forced me to listen if I wanted to get anything done. Listen to fears and frustrations and confusion on the ground. I don't think there was enough listening being done by Fauci in the beginning, or any leadership, really. And I think that is one of the reasons why you saw this groundswell of anger that's still happening, is because people didn't feel heard. And they still don't feel heard by a lot of the systems and a lot of the leaders. And so, can we do better? Yes. Is that the main reason why Fauci was at the hearing today? I don't think so, but I think could be a factor.
David, this is sort of a final question to you both. But David, I want to pick up on something you said at the very beginning. You said, we're going to be living in these different realities going forward. And that sort of was impressed upon you by this hearing. And it seems like one world today said to the other world today, I don't even trust you enough to open my mouth. Like, I'm done. We're not engaging on this topic. It's over. I don't want to end on a depressing note, but it seems like this was a rip the Band-Aid off and kind of get back into these old wounds today for a lot of people seeing this. I mean, talk about how you see these different realities that we are going to be locked into, and the fact that, viruses don't care about our different political allegiances. Like, we're just making ourselves more vulnerable by sticking onto our teams.
Yeah, I mean, I've said before, I may have even said in a previous appearance on this podcast, that I found the early months of 2020 to be an inspiring performance of national and global solidarity, in which many people shouldered the burden of having their lives interrupted to protect those around them and their communities, probably largely out of fear, but nevertheless did it. And I find that, especially in retrospect, moving and kind of shocking. I think one of the great tragic after effects of the pandemic is that it seems to have tilted the dial for many people away from solidarity and towards selfishness, in part because they found the difficulty of doing things for one another a little too much to bear. And I don't think that it's expressed exclusively in the public health arena, but really across the board socially. I see a lot of people who would have once, understood themselves and conducted themselves much more as genuine humanitarians in the world, justifying much more avaricious, rapacious behavior. I think that's all bad. The particular tragedy of this hearing for me was that, I would have told you a couple of months ago, I wrote a piece or two about this, that I thought some of the fever here was breaking. And I thought that, a lot of the COVID resentment that had held the Maha movement together for a long time was disappearing, and we could see a little bit more clearly what was underneath, which was not that half the country thinks the public health establishment needs to be thrown in the trash and burned down, and not that nobody's taking vaccines, but that what we were talking about was a significant but minoritarian movement that saw itself as much larger than it really was because so many people were exhausted and frustrated by the pandemic. That's what I would have told you 2 months ago. And I worry a little bit about what this hearing tells us about where people really are and whether we're ready for a conversation. And I do not mean that just about the Maha right or the MAGA right, because one of the things that's most worried me over the last year, and this is true of the Democratic Party in general, but I think it is maybe especially true of the sort of liberal public health world, is that I don't think we've settled on a set of lessons from COVID. I don't just mean that Rand Paul and Tony Fauci have different views of the lessons. I mean, just looking exclusively on the Democratic side of things, what are the changes we are going to make in a world in which there's a Democratic president starting in 2029? How are we going to recalibrate and redesign policies, pandemic preparedness in particular, but across the board? To what extent are we going to hear the critique from the people who are outraged about that, the experience of 2020, and to what extent are we going to, double down? It's not just that there's an answer out there that I find objectionable. I basically have found liberals, Democrats unwilling to go publicly into that subject area because they think it is so fraught. And I think we are really poorly served heading into the possibility of a new administration if the party that may likely, in my view, is likely to be in charge hasn't really publicly hashed out a new program. I don't know where that leaves us, but I wish I could sit here and say I object to the worldview and point of view of Anthony Fauci's critics on that panel, but at least I know that the health advisors for those Democratic senators are on the right track and have a plan, and I just don't know that they do.
Well, Katelyn, to that point, we hear this all the time, particularly from Democrats and from liberals. No one wants to talk about COVID anymore. No one wants to talk about the pandemic anymore. It doesn't help that pandemic preparedness is also something that's been slashed in this new administration. But I think there is the sense, Katelyn, that it is in the past and we must move forward. But I think David brings up a really good point. Do we feel like we actually do need to pause and reflect on what happened and have real learnings come out of it? Or is it actually important to sort of rebuild in other ways?
I think it's both. I think you need a rehash. I don't know. I think the saddest thing about it is I don't think it's going to happen, which means you're going to have really deep wounds that just open up at events like Fauci being on TV. But to what David was saying, no, they don't have a plan. And this is what I get so frustrated about in this moment is that public health is so good at being on the defense and terrible at being on the offense. What is the alternative pathway forward than the one we are currently on? I have yet to hear a plan. I have yet to see leadership in this. I have yet to see, it is really disappointing, I will say. But to your question, Tom, I want people hearing that I'm not giving up. There's a lot of people that are just not going to give up in this moment. And I think that if we're not going to have this top-down approach of a commission, we're going to have a bottom-up approach to this. And that is individual level conversations. It is listening and actually hearing, like David is saying. It is having really tough ones. And then also imagining where we want to go and how we're going to get there and having the leadership to do it. Because just like Maha, whatever, just like public health, I'm just sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I think that we really need to figure it out for the American people.
Yeah, we've on this show been trying to have a series of conversations with folks who were not thrilled with the public health response during the pandemic to really just engage them in conversations, vaccine hesitant, as well as public health. But the one thing I will say, just maybe on a slightly more up note, we are noticing that people are taking on other issues and other sort of fights, right? Like whether it's data centers or whether it's talking about AI or whether it's all kinds of things. Yeah, healthcare costs, things like that. That while this is maybe this sort of elephant in the room that we need to name and keep talking about, I think there really are opportunities as we kind of move forward to think about some of these other things that as like collectively we're all kind of pissed about, and that maybe that we can channel that towards something. Look, I want to thank both you guys for joining us today, David Wallace-Wells, Katelyn Jetelina. We just needed to kind of unpack some of these ideas, and you guys were the best people to do that with. So a huge thank you to both of you for joining us on Why Should I Trust You?
Thanks for having
us.
And that is our episode today. Please leave us questions, comments at whyshoulditrustyou.net. Rate, like, subscribe. And I'm Brenda Adhikari. He's Tom Johnson. She's Maggie Bartlett. He's Dr. Mark Abdul Malik. That was Katelyn Jetelina, David Wallace-Wells. And we will see you right back here maybe sooner than next week if we drop another special episode, or maybe next week. I don't know yet. But thank you for joining us.